Thank you for joining today for DirectWomen's webinar, Paving the Pathway to the Boardroom, Building a Board-Ready Network. My name is Yesenia Chavarria, and I will be your technical moderator behind the scenes. I'm the Administrative and Events Specialist here at DirectWomen, and I'm excited to be hosting today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to run through a few housekeeping notes. You should all be able to see the screen now and hear my voice. Attendees, however, are muted, so although all of you can hear me, we cannot hear you. That said, you can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so. Please submit questions using the Q&A feature in the Zoom console, not the raised hand or chat features. Feel free to submit questions anytime throughout today's program. Today's webinar will be approximately 1 hour with 45 minutes of content, followed by a few minutes of Q&A. Links to our speakers' biographies will be provided in the chat once the program has begun. Lastly, there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar that we hope you will complete. It is only 4 questions and should take no longer than 2 to 3 minutes tops. With that, I will turn it over to the moderator of today's webinar, Michelle Banks. Michelle?
Hello and Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Michelle Banks, and I will be the moderator of today's program. I am an executive coach with Barker Gilmore, and I was formerly a general counsel and corporate secretary at Gap Inc. I participated in the 2015 DirectWomen Board Institute and then served 2 terms as a member of DirectWomen's board of directors. For almost 20 years, DirectWomen has focused on fulfilling its mission to increase the representation of women lawyers on corporate boards. DirectWomen programming helps to create a pipeline of leaders who can effectively serve in corporate boardrooms. DirectWomen also serves as a resource for companies seeking qualified board candidates. We are very lucky today to be joined on this webinar by a board search professional and 2 alumni of the DirectWomen Board Institute who have successfully joined corporate boards. I am very pleased to have panelists Helene Aschenberg, Juliette Pryor, and Marnie Seif with me today. Helene is the founder and CEO of Gravitas Search. She is a lawyer by training who has more than 30 years experience in the search industry. And her firm offers educational boot camps for next generation general counsels and chief compliance officers. Welcome, Helene. Juliette is a 4-time chief legal officer, currently at Lowe's. She was at Cox when she was first recruited to a corporate board and had joined Albertson by the time she stepped onto that board. I first met Juliette when she was back as general counsel at US Foods. Juliette is a 2018 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute, and she serves on the board of New York Stock Exchange listed Genuine Parts Company. Welcome, Juliette. Marnie's first corporate board was a private venture-backed company she joined while she was a chief legal officer. Marnie was later the chief people officer of Analog Devices. She recently joined her first public company board, Kopin Corporation, which is listed on NASDAQ. Marnie is a 2014 alumna of the DirectWomen Board Institute. Welcome, Marnie. So let's get started. The first question I have, and this one is for Marnie and then Juliette. Why did you each decide to serve on a corporate board? What was your why? So Marnie, let's start with you.
All right. Well, first, thank you for having me on. It's great to be here and talking to all of you. The why of it is that as a lawyer, particularly in a corporate setting in-house, you have so much proximity to the board and you're a member of the management team. And so when you see all of that happening, you think to yourself, this is something I can do and I can add value as a business leader and as, a strategist. So it always just struck me as a natural outgrowth of being a corporate leader.
And Juliette, what is your why, and is it different from Marnie's?
It's not particularly different from Marnie's. Thanks, Michelle, for having me, and thank you to DirectWomen. Glad to be able to be a part of this conversation. I think for me, it was an extension of another way to contribute meaningfully. I think in our daytime roles as senior lawyers, There may be sometimes that we're a little bit boxed in. And so this is a way to sort of continue to build upon that focus as a senior lawyer to really be that business strategist and to step into it from a different perspective by being on the other side of the table in the boardroom. So it was something that as I became more aware, more familiar with corporate directors, I became very clear that it was something that I wanted on my roadmap.
Great. So Helene, you were actually the one who suggested I ask Marnie and Juliet the why question. So now what I would love to hear is, what kind of an answer are you looking for as a board search professional?
Yeah, the why question, the answer to that is a lot more important to search professionals than candidates realize, I think. And Marnie and Juliet gave really good answers. What we're looking for is, well, first of all, our role is to help a company and its board manage risk, have credibility, evaluate long-term fit with the board, right? So boards want directors who are going to be prepared, who are going to ask the hard questions, who are going to remain engaged for a lot of years, and who understand the fiduciary duty. So we want to hear why you're truly motivated to do that. Is it by the company's success, or is it by your own personal brand? If we get a sense that someone is just trying to build a resume, or that they're going to be unprepared, overcommitted, politically driven, lack genuine interest in the company, that's a concern. And so, notice that Julia and Marnie didn't use words like exposure and building their network and learning. They talked about instead being a business decision maker and a strategist. Those are the kinds of things that we want to hear when we ask people, why do you want to do this? Because boards face some ugly stuff: CEO transitions, activist investors, crises, regulatory scrutiny. We want to know whether and how you're going to add value in those types of messy, high stakes situations, and that you're going to really lean in when things get uncomfortable. And your why is the best predictor of that to a search professional.
That's very helpful. I really appreciate that you're saying what you want to hear, but also what you would be listening for that you wouldn't want to hear. I appreciate the practical tips there. So let's tell your stories. Marnie and then Juliet, I would love to hear, how did you obtain your first corporate board seat? And I know that your stories are a little bit different, and I think that that's helpful. As in the real world, one of you got your first board through your network and connections, and one got your first board through a search process. So Marnie, why don't you tell your story first?
Okay, great. And Michelle, you'll let me know if you want me to also explain the ones that didn't work out too, because it's not all perfect, the track record. So yes, as Michelle mentioned in the intro, my first board seat was for a venture-backed company that was trying to go public. And I was referred to them by one of the venture capitalists who I knew, because their model was an IP licensing model. And so that fit with my skill set. And also this VC knew me, so he knew that I was not just a subject matter expert, that I did have sort of a business sense. So that was very personal, and it fit really with the business model because it fit with my expertise of that company. The second one, the public company one, came through someone that I used to work with who became a CEO of Copen, and we connected, and he was changing over the board. And so he kind of knew what I did and how I did it. And so he made the approach. So those were both very personal.
Thank you. And I do want to get to the other part, but let's hold off on that for a moment. And Juliet, let's hear the story of your first board search and how you got on your first board.
Certainly. So obviously, as you mentioned, I went through the DirectWomen program, and I will talk about that later. And so I had all the tools that came through that process. And I thought that I would pursue the board through my network, but instead I got a cold call from a search firm. And it was based on a couple of different industries that I had been in, what I was currently doing, how it tied to the kinds of skills and experience that this particular board was looking for. and my name had been on a short list of someone that knew me, but not deeply, but knew me. And the first conversation went well. I guess I didn't say I was, looking to burnish my own brand or something to that effect. And it sort of grew from there. But it was a cold call from a recruiter that I had not worked with before, who had worked for a long time with that particular company with Genuine Parts, and had some connections around certain experiences on my resume that had made my name be a part of the small group that they were moving forward. And then less than a year later, I was on that board, and also made a job change in the middle of it.
So they came to you, but Helene, I would love to hear your perspective on at what point should prospective director candidates reach out to a search firm? And are there more effective ways to do it? Should people do it cold? Should they do it by email or in some other way? And what types of things are you looking for? So what is your advice generally on people being more proactive with the search firm process?
Yeah, you have to get the timing right. You don't want to engage too early, too late, or be too transactional. I tell people that they should reach out when they are board ready, not board curious. And there's a difference, right? If you think about search firms, our most valuable commodity is our time. So we're going to engage more actively when a candidate is credible and defensible today, not aspirational. So what does board ready actually mean? So I would say a prospective director is board ready when they've operated at the C-suite or one rung below. They have what we call pattern recognition, meaning that they've seen things over time, that they can see trends, things like M&A, capital allocation issues, restructuring, regulatory risk, technology or cyber risk, talent, succession, culture issues. Someone who's seen things over a longer horizon, and is able to recognize patterns, that's very valuable to a board. That you can clearly articulate how you're going to add value to the boardroom, not just as a manager, and that you're prepared for the fiduciary accountability, not an advisory influence. And most importantly, I think, is that you have the time, capacity, and emotional energy to serve properly. Those are important because if you're in the throes of an executive role that is going through a crisis or a spin-off or something that's taking all of your time, you're not going to be as attractive to a board at that moment in time. And to answer the other question, Michelle, about how to best engage, Julia and Marnie both were identified by boards as someone that they would be of interest to them. For us, the best way is through a warm introduction. Ideally, someone who serves on a board and who can vouch for your readiness, or through networking at events like the DirectWomen event. Like, these are people that serve on boards that know what it takes to transition from or to add an executive role, a board role to an executive role. That perspective is really valuable to a search professional. It's not just our interview of you. It's also, what do people who serve on boards think of the way that you will operate in that environment? Does that answer your question?
Yes, and that's helpful because I think that sometimes people don't realize how clubby the board world is, and it really matters if you know people who are on boards. And I think that sometimes people have a little bit of a different perspective on that. When I was on the DirectWomen board, I did recruiting for the DirectWomen Board Institute, and people's natural instincts were often to get referrals from people that weren't really who people are looking for. People are really looking for, what is your relationship with people who serve on boards? And if someone's going to give you a recommendation or a referral, the best one you can get is someone who has seen you in a boardroom and has served on multiple corporate boards. So that's helpful that you're pretty clear about that. So Juliet, let's go over to you. I have a question that's sort of about the timing question. When did you start thinking about corporate board service in your own career? And what would you recommend to others now that you've sat on a board and you know how the board networking world works?
I probably became interested about probably 10 years into my career, maybe a little bit later. And so I probably was in that phase of bored curious that Helene used a few moments ago. And at that point, I was just having some encounters with people who were board members and just sort of like, how are they doing this? and what is the pathway to get here? And frankly, none of them were lawyers, by the way, at that point. So I really didn't even understand all of those aspects of anyone other than kind of finance business operators being board members way back then. This is 20 years ago. So it was a process that was not very clearly defined. I know we're going to talk about DirectWomen. I think it got much more clear for me by going through the DirectWomen process, because it was just me sort of having this interest, this curiosity, and having conversations with leaders that I worked with who were directors because of personal relationship, but not having clarity around path. And quite honestly, at that time, 20 years ago, when I was 10 years in, I don't think a lot of those business people had a clear sense of lawyers being on boards, And so it was of interest to me because it seemed like a way to be in a particular set of strategic conversations, but it wasn't obvious to those that I was interacting with that it was a viable path.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that's right. And there has been a lot written and a lot spoken about in terms of the value of lawyers on corporate boards that didn't exist 30 years ago. Agreed. Marnie, you offered earlier to talk about what doesn't always go great and how sometimes you have to try for boards before you get the first board. I know many people, including many very accomplished and successful people who've spent 2, 3, 4 years trying to get on their first board. So since you offered, I appreciate your transparency. Tell us about the processes that didn't necessarily work out, but maybe they did work
out. They didn't work out in that I didn't get the seat, but I think you learn from every single experience you have. So I had two in particular. One was a divestiture of a public company. There was a divestiture, and that new entity, the spin out, was going to go public. So they were putting the board together and getting their governance in shape and all of that. It was an established business. And it was sort of a warm introduction that it came through somebody I didn't know, but they knew someone I knew. Okay, but I didn't know this person. So they were trying to figure out what the board would be comprised of. And that's the whole question of what are the skill sets around the table, right? So they were kind of putting it all together. And because they were in the midst of trying to go public and all of this, time went on. And I interviewed with them for about 10 months. I must have talked to 17 people. And at the end of it all, they decided that they wanted someone, even though everybody liked me and I liked them, they wanted somebody with capital allocation experience to fill that particular seat because the business needed that insight. So that was a disappointment, but they had to do what was right for them in terms of getting the expertise around the table. The second experience was really strange. I got contacted by an activist who had taken a position in a public company, and they had a plan they were going to take out part of the board and change out the CEO, and they wanted to put forth a slate of credible alternatives. And it was so interesting. As a lawyer, you just love this playbook. I couldn't believe how fast they were moving on this thing and all of that. So I knew that board was going to be pushed to take on probably an ex-CFO and probably somebody who had been a CEO in the industry. So I knew that I was lower down in terms of their preference from my skill set, but it was still completely fascinating to go through it. And I really gave it a go. I mean, I did the whole board interview, and it was tense because they were being dealt with by an activist. So it was a little bit hostile, like, who are you and why do you want to join this board? But I actually liked the people on the board. And like I said, I knew that their preference was to get an ex-CEO and an ex-CFO, but still a great learning experience.
So it sounds like you would do those again for, if nothing else, the learning experience. One of my mentors told me when I was thinking about doing corporate board service, which I eventually decided not to do, but when I was thinking about doing it, she said, you might want to interview for a board before your dream board. And that seemed like
Yeah,
good advice.
it is. I mean, I did some practice interviews through a boot camp, not at DirectWomen. I did another one, and I really got dressed down by the person who did the interview. He told me this is years ago, to inform or this or that. So it is so valuable to practice. It's better not to practice on the board you'd like to be. So if you can test yourself out with someone you trust before the interview, that's a good thing. But when you know that you're less likely to be chosen, as I was, this activist was, I knew what they were pushing for to add to the board. It wasn't my skill set, but I like to get to know these people, so still it's good to practice before you actually get on the call with these folks.
Helene, it occurs to me that while we're talking about practicing, you might have some suggestions around that. The board interview process in particular. Is there anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, it's not entirely dissimilar from the interview process for an executive role. But you have to just always have that little, angel on your shoulder that tells you you need to talk about yourself in a way that reveals your value as a business leader, as a strategist, not as an advisor. And that's so hard for lawyers to do. I've seen it many times that, we have them prepped, ready to go, and then the feedback is that they spoke like a lawyer. They just demonstrated their value as a lawyer, a legal executive, a leader, but not what the board needed. And so it's something that really does need practice, and in particular from people like you, all the three of you, that sit there and know what it takes to be an effective board member and to get the job, so to speak, to go through the interview process and be selected. It's not easy to do, particularly from a legal role.
So, Juliet, you mentioned that you wanted to talk about the Board Institute. And I know one of the things that you said is that you were a bit hesitant to reach out to your network to help you obtain a board seat until you went through the program. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how that helped you, Juliet.
Sure. So one of the aspects of the program is, as a participant, you're expected to put together your network and actually practice some of that outreach. And when I first did the assignment, I think I had like 4 names, and they were like, "You've been doing this for how many years? You got 4 names." And my comeback was, well, I haven't spoken to so-and-so in 2 years, or I haven't spoken to so-and-so in 5 years, which is not good, but it was just my reality. And they said, you can call somebody you haven't spoken to in a decade. You can call people. And, as I reflected, there were many people who have reached out to me where we haven't spoken for more than a decade, and they're rekindling a relationship. But I was telling myself that I could not do that. And so through the coaching of the DirectWomen program, I greatly expanded the list, and we kindled a lot of conversations and figured out, that you can rewarm your network, even if it's been many years and you're probably a participant and others doing it to you. So that helped me tremendously.
Well, knowing you, I bet there were plenty of people who were happy to help you. One thing I wanted to touch on that I think Helene started to touch on, which are areas of expertise or experiences that are valuable. So Marnie, I'll start with you. How much of a role do you think your industry or experience or your subject matter expertise has played in you serving on corporate boards and getting chosen for a board?
So I was in the semiconductor industry for 16 years, which is deep and sort of arcane in some ways. And nobody cared about it until the last sort of, 10 years. It was like a backwater until it was suddenly a national security priority. But because it is so, there's so much depth to the elements of the IP and the manufacturing and selling and all that, my experience in that industry was helpful for those kinds of boards, because semiconductor companies tend to want people that know what they're talking about in the meeting because they get very technical. So it was helpful to me. Increasingly, though, I found not only that, but it was the experiences I had. So I did a lot of mergers. I did probably $40 billion worth of mergers. So it wasn't that I did those mergers, it's that I helped structure them and then lived through the integration of them and what worked and what didn't. That became kind of the valuable piece of it, as opposed to this is my list of things I did. Sometimes lawyers love to talk about the list of things they did. And it's better to talk about results than it is to talk about tasks. And that's hard for us lawyers sometimes.
Well, and I liked what Helene said about pattern recognition. That wasn't something I've actually heard before. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
Helene, you mentioned M&A, regulatory, cyber, talent. Is there any other areas of expertise? If people are thinking about what they may have as potential opportunities to expand their roles, their responsibilities, what are areas that are sought after?
Yeah, it's kind of like going to the college counselor when your son or daughter is a senior and finding out that they should have been involved in all these extracurricular activities starting when they were a freshman. Like, you don't want that to happen. So while people are mid-career, I tell them that that's when they can still shape themselves into credible future directors rather than being pigeonholed into technicians or risk identifiers or not decision owners, right? Boards want decision owners. So those are the experiences beyond the things I named that I would say you should really try to focus on in your career, if you're aspiring eventually to a board seat. You want to think like an owner. Both business ownership exposure is critical. If you can't own a P&L, which some lawyers can't, right? Serve as a general counsel or a DGC for a business unit as opposed to staying at the corporate center. Boards want you to have been in the room as a participant, not as just an advisor when hard business decisions are being made. You want to develop your transactions judgment and M&A decision-making capabilities. Marnie just mentioned it wasn't the act of doing the M&A deal, it was the fact that she did a number of them and saw what worked and what didn't. She was able to recognize the patterns that I alluded to earlier. That was part, I'm sure, of her pitch for why she would be a valuable director. It's taking on opportunities to participate in what I would call risk oversight as opposed to risk avoidance. And and then the obvious one that lawyers can usually master more easily than others is becoming literate in corporate governance. That's very helpful and another, box that you can check as a lawyer, in terms of substantive experience.
That makes sense. Most of my friends that are on board serve on the governance committee and are popular chairs for the governance committee. So, Juliet, you were working full time when you got on your first corporate board. Did you tell your CEO? Did you tell the board? Was that part of your networking towards board service to talk openly about wanting to get on a board? Or was that something you chose not to discuss?
No, I absolutely told the CEO that I was with when I first joined the board. And I also raised it when I was being recruited away for my next CLO job to say, I serve in this public company board. I'd like to continue serving if I take this new role. Here's the value that I think it brings for me as an executive, to be able to contribute in this way and to grow. And I don't think it deters from my ability to come take your new role. Are you supportive? And I'm not sure that I would have taken the next role and now it's been 2 roles because I've been on this board for a while, if those CEOs had been disinclined to have me also have this board seat. So it was definitely something that I discussed. I couldn't imagine trying to do it without discussing it with your CEO, especially in a public company CLO role. You've got to tell them you're thinking about it, and they've got to be supportive. I did not talk about it with the boards of the companies where I'm the chief legal officer, just my CEO in each instance.
But Michelle, do you mind if I jump in on
I would
that?
love it.
I actually think that that's a really important point, Juliet. You know, you were already on a board when you made a transition. There are times when someone's making a GC transition and the CEO that they're going to work for or potentially going to work for is not in favor of his, her, their executives serving on corporate boards. That's something that you want to know when you are transitioning to a new role because that sets back your clock X number of years for the tenure of that CEO potentially. If and maybe you can try to convince them otherwise, but I think that that's an uphill climb. So it's something really important to note when you go to executive roles that that can seriously hamper your ability to get on a board, even if one is perfect for you.
Yep.
Marnie, you're shaking your head. Did you want to add anything there?
That is so true. I mean, I don't even know what else to say, but that is perfectly put for both of you. It's just, you don't want to find yourself in a position where you're stymied for your own, ambition. But on the other hand, it's a lot of work to be on a board. So realizing that and putting the time and having the time to put into it, if you're stepping up to a big new role and it's a bigger thing than you've ever done, it might not be the greatest time in the world to be looking for a board seat too, because you want to show that new company that you can really make an impact. You want to develop yourself there. So, it's a timing question more than anything. But I think CEOs who don't like the idea of it sometimes can be convinced once they've seen that you're managing things and that you're very effective. It's more, I don't think they're so rigid a lot of the time, if they know their folks and they know they can handle it.
I think that's a fair point. Also, I would say when I went through these transitions, neither of these were instances where it was my first chief legal officer role, right? And I
Right.
think if I were taking on my first chief legal officer role and taking on my first board seat at the same,
Yeah.
that would be too much. And so this timing point that Marnie's pointing out, I think matters a great deal.
Well, and I liked how you talked about it, Juliet, because it came across as a win-win. And I actually truly believe it is a win-win for the company and for the executive. So hopefully most people will see it that way. So we said that we would answer your questions. I think this is probably a good point in time to pause and see, Yesenia, if you have some audience questions to share with us.
Thank you, Michelle. We do. We've had an engaging audience. The first question, is a candidate more attractive while they are still sitting C-suite executive or after they're retired, or does it not matter?
Helene, why don't we pass that one to you to start?
I don't think it matters, provided that the person is going to demonstrate their ability to prepare and commit and show up. I think the more likely path is for someone to take on board seats upon retirement. That's when it happens more often. After a confluence of a career that they can see all the value that they would bring to an organization, but it could and does happen while people are in the executive chair. And I don't think it matters to search professionals or to boards, provided that the indicia that I mentioned are in evidence.
Thank you. Next question, Yesenia?
We can't hear you.
We can't hear
You're
you.
muted.
Thank you. A very popular question. What is the view of starting with serving on nonprofit or charitable organizations and transitioning over to for-profit organizations? Do they help, or should you just skip that process altogether?
I was
This
actually
is
going to
an
talk about this.
interesting one.
Yeah.
This is an interesting one, and I've heard very different answers to it. So Helene, let's start with you again.
Yeah, I actually see a lot of value from being on a nonprofit board. Perhaps the substance is not exactly the same because it's not a public company, but there's value to just being on a board with peers, understanding the protocols, how to show up in a board, what the issues are, how decisions are made. I think all of those are good experiences, whether they prepare you specifically for the challenges you might see as a director in a public company. Probably not precisely, but it gives you more confidence going for the next one that you've at least been in that environment before. So I'm a big believer in the nonprofit board as a credential. But as Michelle said, people differ on that point.
Well, and one thing that I would say is nonprofit boards are very different. So it will be very helpful to you if you serve on a larger nonprofit
Right.
board that operates more similarly to a corporate board. And there are opportunities for you, for example, to serve on a compensation committee or to serve on a governance committee or to serve on an audit committee. Then you're getting an experience that is somewhat transferable. But there are very small nonprofits where they're running on a shoestring and there's nothing really resembling a corporate board experience.
No, I agree with that. 1,000%.
But I'm glad that you view it positively because I do too.
I view anything that a general counsel or a lawyer does in the course of their career as potentially additive to the board experience. But, some of them are going to be more valuable than others, depending on the nature of the company, the industry, the composition of the board. There are a lot of factors that go into whether the in particular individual's experiences translate. But size of nonprofit, you're absolutely right. I should have mentioned that.
Well, the other thing I will say, having served on very small and very large nonprofit boards, is that the larger the nonprofit board, the more likely you are to serve with CEOs and CFOs. And those are the people that you want to network with and who will eventually help you get on a corporate board. And if they see you in a boardroom and see that you're collaborative and smart and strategic, they may invite you to be on their board someday. So there are definitely benefits. Yesenia, next question.
Okay. Helene touched on this a bit by referencing that positioning yourself for opportunities to be a business owner is important. But for Marnie and Juliet, looking back, what capability or perspective do you wish you had intentionally developed earlier before joining your first board?
They're so accomplished, it's very hard for them to think
I'm very
of what
aware.
experience they don't have.
I'm very aware that this pause sounds like, what don't I know? I'm not sure that I waited well into my career and tried to do a lot to prepare to be able to go into the boardroom and had changed industries and so forth a fair amount.
What about anything financial? Is there anything financial that you wish you had learned earlier or more broadly?
I mean, because I'm not a finance person and I don't qualify as a financial expert, I always spend more time trying to make sure that I'm following carefully and understanding on the finance side of things. I actually first served on the audit committee in this current board that I'm on. But I don't know if I want to say I wish I had studied more in the finance space. I'm always trying to stay sharp in that space because it's not my go-to space and it's not my background, but I don't feel completely out of water in the space. It's something I've had to pay attention to given the roles that I've been in.
Marnie, I don't know if you have an answer to the original question about what do you wish you learned earlier, or is there a gap in your experience I wish you had? But I'm also curious, in addition to the answer to that, do you feel like you use your chief legal officer or your chief people officer skills more often in the boardroom?
So just to this question, I had this range of roles. I did communications. It's insane. I did brand. We rebranded the company because in a semiconductor company, they don't want any overhead. So like if there's somebody smart that's hanging around they'll just give you another job to do. So I had had a bunch of different experiences where I had kind of, led project teams. So I felt pretty well prepared, and I'd been around the boardroom forever, and we had been through so much of everything. The thing that I was glad that I did know, because I'll never be a financial expert, most lawyers won't be, but the thing that I knew very well was executive comp. And that is a black box. I've got to tell you, a lot of people do not understand it. And I first just been with the comp committee for years, and then I served as chief people officer, and I went through, I did executive search, but I also did compensation packages, and particularly designing those packages so that the shareholders would find them to be aligned with their interests, and being able to talk about those packages in a way that was compelling. So, and employees would understand also. So understanding compensation is, I think, really just one of the it's almost like you don't know you need it till you think to yourself, I really wish I seemed like I'd understood that. It's a great thing to know. And as lawyers, you can learn that stuff because you sit in proximity to your HR lead.
Any more questions, Yesenia?
We do. This one's about networking. Are there certain networking events you would recommend, or is it better to do individual outreach when building your networking around people specifically serving on boards?
Okay, why don't we go around, all three of you. Helene, I'll start with you. Are there particular networking events that you will make the time to show up at and that you think are particularly valuable, or that you see repeatedly on people's resume or mentioned by people? Or do you really think that this is more of a one-to-one process?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I show up at DirectWomen. I am a huge fan of the organization and the value that it drives to its participants, particularly in the Institute, but also just to the general events over the course of the year and the opportunity to get to know other directors. I think that's a great place to start. I do think that, to the point Juliet was making earlier, you have to reach out to people in your network that you know, and let them know, connect the dots for them, let them know that you are looking for a board seat and would love their advice on how to position yourself. People are willing, I think, to take the time to give guidance. And while you have them for coffee or for lunch, you can ask them if there are any open seats anticipated on the boards that they serve on. But I do think it's more one-on-one. I wouldn't say, other than DirectWomen, that there's this other, list of organizations to show up at. At least not that I've seen.
Marnie, would you answer any differently?
Well, I think it's good to get involved with things like NACD or something like that, but where there are a lot
That's
of
the
directors.
National Association of Corporate Directors, in case
Right.
people don't know.
But you can't join that until it's a little chicken and the egg thing. You can join, they have a kind of board want to be ready kind of track or something. But I just don't think that networking with strangers is, unless there's just some bolt of lightning that they're looking for somebody just like you and you fit, again, the matrix of skills that they want or experiences. I think it's just invaluable to talk to people that know what you can do. What is your value proposition? Because there's just a limited number of seats at the table. So they're going to want to choose wisely. And I think meeting somebody in a meeting is probably low likelihood of bearing fruit.
So I'll jump in. Don't disagree with either of the answers given, but just to be additive and a little bit tangential to this, but related. Recently I was a reference for one of my former CEOs for a new board he wanted to go on. And I raise that to say, in the networking process, thinking of it as mutual, we've kept that relationship going. And so he called me and said, "Hey, I'm being considered for this board. It'd really be great if you talk to them. They want, And to me, that is the best level of saying that we're keeping that relationship going. And so I just sort of throw that out there for people as they think about networking, to not think of it as one way. I do think it's mostly one-on-one. I do think it's most impactful with people that you know, but you also can be a resource for others, even if you're not on a board, um, because you've had these relationships that you've worked together, you've been in a foxhole together. So if you haven't maintained them, like I confessed earlier that I did not, you can rekindle them. And you can also be a resource to those folks. And I suspect whenever it is that I might be looking to be on another board, that CEO is the kind of person that I would be calling to say, I'm ready for another board. So just think of it as a mutual thing and not just a one way. Who can help me do what I want to do?
Great. Thank you all for answering that one. Yesenia, do you have any more questions?
I did have one about this. Let me see. Okay. Going the route of a candidate put forward by an activist, any thoughts on how that might affect future opportunities that come through more traditional routes, such as search firms, investors, or current board members?
Helene, you're shaking your head. You sound like you might have an opinion on that one.
Yeah, I mean, when Marnie was describing the activists having reached out to put together alternatives to the directors that were on the board, it occurs to, I think, everyone that that's a hard position to be in as a director. You're being shoved down the throats of the other directors, probably not that excited to have you, and you have to insinuate yourself into this dynamic. So yeah, it's hard for the individual, and I do think that I never really thought about candidates that way of like either you're for management or you're for the activist, but I do think it probably does pigeonhole you a little bit as to someone who's willing to be that disruptive. Most boards that are in more what I'll call maintenance mode wouldn't be that excited to have that. So you have to think very, very carefully before you take on that kind of role. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah. Although I will say in the circumstance that I was interviewing for, number one, the people that they chose were really good, and the board has gone on to be very functional, and the stock price has moved up and life went on very well. There are people that are executives that are very established, credible people who now are kind of linked into activist networks. They're not garbage that are being thrown onto boards to
Oh.
just do the activist bidding. It's become more, I think, sophisticated than that. Not for all, but for some, where, they're trusted people that will go on and actually serve the shareholders' interests. They're not there just to serve the activist interests. But that's a different path. To Helene's point, if you're in that world, that's your world, and that's probably where your opportunities will come from.
Well, I want to be sure that before we end this program, we give each of you a chance to share some other topics. So I've asked you questions, the audience has asked you questions, but I would love to give each of you a few minutes just to share, are there any lessons learned or specific pieces of advice if people are listening to this webinar early in their career because they may be interested in board service today, mid-career because they're starting to think about building a board network, or they're in the throes of the board search process. Really, you can speak to anyone in any of those audiences, but I just want to give you a chance if there's any topic that I haven't asked you about or the audience hasn't asked you about that you would like to raise, or any wisdom you'd like to share. I would like to give you each an opportunity to contribute something. So Juliet, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to a comment that Marnie made earlier about one of the boards that she didn't get and the particular skill that they wanted, which was not what she was offering up. And just sort of remind folks as they go on this journey to really be clear about what are their skills that they're bringing to these opportunities, and be clear about, if you get the inbound call, why are they calling you? what is the board looking for and how does it match up? And I think it's a little bit about be selective. I get the sense often that people have a little bit of, I just got to get on a board. And it's a very long-term, heavy lift commitment. So be thoughtful about what you can contribute, what they are looking for, right? How it ties to what you want to meaningfully contribute, who you want to be together with multiple times a year for years to come, and be more selective and thoughtful about the match, the contribution of your skill, the need of that board, and if one doesn't work out, continue the process, because it's best that you go to one where the skill and need match versus trying to shoehorn in just to get into any board.
That's great advice. Helene, how about you?
I agree with what Juliet just said. And I think to some extent, the selection process determines that for you in a lot of cases, if it's not the right match. But yeah, but I do think that candidates could be a lot more thoughtful about the fit on their end and not just sort of be more passive in the selection process. I guess two pieces of advice that I was thinking about. One is we didn't talk about on this call the value of an international board. Sometimes it's easier to get a board seat in the UK or in another country if you have some nexus or expertise in that place. The particulars are different in terms of the requirements. They meet more often, they pay less. There are issues that you need to be aware of, but that is an additional path that people can consider when thinking about board service in a public company environment. And some of the companies, for example, in the UK are significantly smaller than US big public companies. And so it's a little bit easier, to demonstrate that the experience you had is as big or bigger potentially than their own organizations. So that's one thing that I just think is worth mentioning as another route. The other is, just to put a finer point on it, for years, general counsels, lawyers could not get on boards. It was definitely the exception rather than the rule. And I think where the rubber really hits the road for lawyers is that you need to think about your value differently. You need to demonstrate that you can make judgments under ambiguous situations where there's no perfect answer. That's what the boards value. They don't prioritize being right or being perfectionist, the comma in the wrong place that we talked about when we were on the call before this panel started. They want you to own the decision, not just advise or present options. And if you can cast your experience in that way to demonstrate that you really have owned the decision, you go from being the lawyer in the room to being a decision maker in the room. And I think that is the leap that people need to make to become a director. It's a really important one. And if you heard Juliet and Marnie telling their why at the beginning, they both hit on that. And it was very natural for them. I'm sure they don't even think about doing that anymore.
Thank you. Marnie, what about you? Any topic you want to touch on that we haven't already touched on, or lessons learned?
I will just amplify what Helene and Juliet said. I'll say it kind of my way, which is the hardest thing in the world for lawyers is to be able to state their value proposition. That isn't like a list of all these things I did. Because that skill set of all the things I did is rentable. It's called outside counsel. So boards don't need that person on the board. What they need is somebody who can speak as a business leader, business owner, and to the way Helene put it, a decision maker. So it's very, very hard for lawyers to talk about their value prop. And your board bio is really where you struggle, and the board bio is never settled. It's always sort of in flux, but practicing what you bring to any circumstance as a business leader first will help you get your next general counsel job and it will help you talk to somebody who's going to listen to you for about 30 seconds. Nobody's listening past 30 seconds. So being tight with your messaging is great, and it takes practice. And all I can say is you don't get there without practicing. So focus on your value prop.
I couldn't agree more. The elevator pitch is so important. And the more you practice it and the more you evolve it, the better and better it gets. Well, I want to thank each of the three of you for your time and for your wisdom and your thoughts and your participation today. I appreciate the audience participating, and we want you to know that you will be invited to future webinars and you will be on the DirectWomen mailing list since you participated in this webinar. And we look forward to you joining us for other DirectWomen events. Thank you all for participating today. And again, Happy New Year and farewell, everyone. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.